Hi Year 8, welcome back to your next lesson with me, Miss Thika. Today we are continuing with our Her Story unit where we're looking at the history of women throughout time. Last lesson we looked at the role of women in medicine and we looked at 3 key individuals. Today we are focusing on the role that women played in the fight for the vote. So today we are thinking about how and why did women campaign for the vote in the early 1900s. So get that down as your title. First things first, I've uploaded a quiz onto Teams, a multiple choice quiz that I would like you to do. This is a quiz containing questions from all the lessons we've done so far on the Her Story unit. So I'd like you to complete that. But also at the bottom of the quiz, there's a 4-mark question, which I'm going to talk you through in a second because that's on the next slide. So complete your multiple choice quiz, but then leave the last question, which I'm going to talk to you through now, or maybe just listen to me talk through it first and then go back and do it. Please try to complete the 4-mark question in full so that your teacher can mark it and they can give you a little bit of advice on how to improve it, or if you got 4 marks out of 4 marks. So we're going to be looking at some sources, we're going to be identifying the key differences between the suffragette movement and the suffragist movement, and we're going to be explaining reactions to women's fight for the vote. So, key word that I'd like you to write down for me, please, is suffrage. This is a word that you probably are not familiar with, but it's going to be a word that I'll be talking about and I'll be mentioning throughout this lesson, so you need to understand its meaning. The word suffrage just means basically the right to vote in political elections. So women's suffrage is the women for right. Sorry, that sentence doesn't make sense. Women's suffrage is the right for women to vote. Working men's suffrage is the right for working men to vote, and so on. So the fight for suffrage is the fight to vote. Sometimes, depending on what information you're reading, it won't say voting, it might say the franchise. The franchise was the old-fashioned term for having the right to vote. So if I read information later that says women's fight for the franchise, again, that just means the vote. So during the early 1900s, Britain saw an increased campaign for the suffrage movement, mostly the right for women to vote in elections. Women over a certain age could vote in local elections for local MPs, but women could not vote in general elections. So they could not vote for members of parliament, and they couldn't have their say, for example, on who would be prime minister and other political debates, for example, like the law and things like that. So they were very limited. So this is the 4-mark question that I was talking about earlier that is going to be a question in your quiz. I will try to make sure that I can get this picture on your quiz so you can see it when you go to answer it. But if not, that's the source you use in there if technology fails me. So the 4-mark question is, give 2 things you can infer from this source about attitudes towards women in the early 1900s. So the picture here, it's a drawing, it's a cartoon, and it says, a woman's mind magnified. And we've got a woman here with her eyes closed, obviously she's not got any hair, and the picture is zooming into her brain, and it's showing the reader or the person studying this cartoon what women think about. So we've got a box of chocolates, we've got a baby, a puppy, a nice new dress, 2 men, a wedding ring, love letters, and a nice fancy hat. So, give 2 things you can infer from this source about attitudes towards women in the early 1900s. Remember, if you are inferring, infer means to learn. So what can you learn from this source about attitudes towards women? And set it out like this for me, please. So I've given you some sentence starters. One thing I can infer from this sources. One thing I can infer from this source about attitudes towards women in the early 1900s is, and tell me something you can infer. So tell me something you can see, then full stop, then explain what that's showing about attitudes towards women. Then for your next 2 marks, you need to do the same thing again, but you must give me something different. Make sure you're not writing about the same thing twice. Another thing I can infer from this source about attitudes towards women in the early 1900s is, again, have another look, tell me something you can see, something you can learn, full stop, and then explain that. So this is how you're going to structure your 4-mark question on your quiz on Teams. Okay, so for today, we are going to be investigating 2 different political groups that fought for women's suffrage in the late 1800s and the early 1900s. So you're going to need a Venn diagram for this, and again I'll put this template on Teams, but if not, it might just be easier for you to draw this yourself. So a Venn diagram is 2 circles, but they must overlap in the middle. So at the top of one circle you need the suffragists, at the top of your other circle you need suffragettes, and both in the middle here. You're going to write key pieces of information in this bubble about the suffragists, key pieces of information in this bubble about the suffragettes, and then anything that applies to both of them, so any similarities, would go in the middle here. And then challenge question, if you want it. Try to move this down a little bit because it's a bit of a squish. Impact of the groups. Would you argue that one group was more successful than the other in their campaign? Because they were both campaigning for exactly the same thing. They wanted women's suffrage. They wanted women to be given the right to vote. But would you argue that one group was perhaps more successful or perhaps had a bigger impact than the other? So I'll pause this now if you're going to copy this down, and I'll give you time to find this diagram in Teams as well if you are wanting to use this exact one. So the first thing you're going to do is you're going to find this video on YouTube for me. I did try to embed this in the PowerPoint, but it wouldn't work due to copyright reasons. So if you type into YouTube suffragettes versus suffragists, this should be the first one that comes up. So it's 6 minutes 33 seconds long, and it's from channel 4, and that's the picture that it has at the start. Suffragettes versus suffragettes did violent protest to get women the vote. So watch this video and pause it when you need to get some information down in your Venn diagram, and then I'll go through some extra information with you as well. So there should be plenty of points in your Venn diagram. It should be absolutely full. So watch the video first, add points to your Venn diagram, and then come back to me and we'll go over some extra information. Okay, first one, extra information. This is information about the suffragists. So, by the late 19th century, parliamentary reforms had given more men the right to vote in Britain, whilst petitions to enfranchise women were mocked and rejected. Growing anger turned into action, and the National Union of Women's Suffrage Societies was formed in 1897 from numerous local women's suffrage societies. Its leader, Millicent Fawcett, became one of the most prominent middle-class women campaigning peacefully for the right to vote. By the early 1900s, the suffragists were flourishing, with a rising membership and an efficient nationwide organisation. By 1914, the NUWSS, which is just a shorter term for the National Union of Women's Suffrage Societies, a bit of a mouthful I know, had approximately 54,000 members, so that is an awful lot of people that had joined it. The vast majority of people that became members of the suffragist movement were middle-class, respectable citizens. Key word there, citizens and not women. Men could also join the suffragist movement, and a lot of them did. There were male members that were campaigning, supporting their wives or their sisters, or just generally the right for women to have more equality and to be able to vote like men. So men could join the suffragist movement too. Millicent Fawcett passionately believed that non-violent campaigning would eventually lead to constitutional change. She wanted to prove through petitions, lobbying of MPs and other peaceful protests that women were respectable and responsible enough to participate in politics. Now this is an important point to stress. Millicent Fawcett argued that a lot of men thought that women were not responsible enough, that women were not educated enough, were not calm enough, women were irrational, they were too emotional, therefore they didn't deserve the right to vote. So, to kind of fight back against that, Millicent Fawcett stressed we have to be sort of cool, calm and collected about this, otherwise that's just proving to men that we aren't responsible enough for the vote. So we have to behave in a really calm manner and be patient and hope for change over time, and then eventually we'll get what we want. Suffragists believed in a gradualist strategy. That means change over a long period of time, so it's quite a slow movement, using non-violent tactics to persuade the country that women deserve the vote. The broad focus of the suffragists is reflected in the colours adapted by the group. So they wore these colours whenever they protested or marched. They wore green, white and red sashes, which literally stands for Give Women Rights. Green, give, white, women, red, rights. However, this actually clashed with the sashes that the other group, the suffragettes, wore. The sashes that they wore were green, white and violet. Violet is a shade of purple, which literally stand for Give Women Votes. So you could see the subtle differences there. If any of you are a fan of the film Mary Poppins, not the one that was released a couple of years ago, the classic Mary Poppins, right at the start of the film, I can't remember her name now. The mum, I can't remember her full name in the film, it's been years since I've seen Mary Poppins. At the start of the film, the mum of the children, she is a suffragette, and she comes marching into the house with her sash on, and that is vibrant green, white and violet, and she's singing a song about the movement. Next one. After 6 years with little progress, a number of women across the country became frustrated with Millicent Fawcett's moderate campaigning style. In 1903, the Women's Social and Political Union, again shortened to WSPU, but also known as Suffragettes, was formed, and this group was led by Emmeline Pankhurst. Now, there is a subtle difference in name here. So obviously the first one that I just talked about was known as suffragists, whereas this group here is known as suffragettes. I personally, and this is just something a bit daft that I do, the way that I remember it to go the right way round is, I think, like, suffragette, a jet is like really fast, like zoom. Jets are also quite noisy and quite loud, and that goes with the style of the suffragettes. They were really fast, really noisy and loud, but actually it doesn't mean that. The term suffragette was actually created by the Daily Mail, the newspaper, as a bit of a dig, because the term jet is Latin for belittle, and obviously if you're trying to belittle someone, that's not very nice. It means you're trying to make them small. It's an insult. But actually the women just took it and ran with it and went with it and decided, well, you know what, if you're going to call us horrible names, then we'll just call ourselves that. So they decided to refer to themselves as suffragettes, even though it was actually meant as an insult. So Mrs. Pankhurst, Emmeline Pankhurst, ran the organisation with her daughter Christabel. The suffragettes believed in deeds, not words, and Pankhurst, who had actually been a member of the Manchester suffragist group, believed it was time for direct action by working class women who would use any means necessary to secure the vote. And here, again, that should be a key difference that you've noticed. It was aimed at working class women. If you were a man, you were not allowed to be a member of the suffragette movement. You were allowed to be a member of the suffragists, but it was only women that were allowed to join the suffragette movement. Now, some historians debate to what extent the group can actually be labelled terrorists for their actions. The suffragettes believed in civil disobedience, and I've put some examples down here of some of the things that they did to capture people's attention. They disrupted Parliament, They chained themselves to railings, they smashed windows by throwing bricks through them, they burned down churches, they held huge marches and demonstrations with the purpose to disrupt the local area. They violently attacked politicians. In fact, the Prime Minister at the time had assassination attempts. Someone threw an axe at him, which didn't hit him in the face, but it did hit a man next to him and it cut his ear. They also tried to blow up a theatre that he was watching a production in. They set fire to post boxes. They also went into museums with knives in their pockets and slashed really expensive old classical paintings. Pankhurst's daughter, Christabel, was charged with obstruction after she interrupted a Liberal Party meeting. And this is where we start to see a little bit of change. When she was arrested, she chose to be sent to prison over paying a fine, and her being sent to prison attracted considerable attention to the suffragette cause, and this became an inspiration to other people. So after this, arrests became much more common than they were before. And again, this results in change. This led to a new tactic, hunger strike. So if you go on hunger strike, that means that you point blank refuse to eat until you get what you want, to the point where you are willing to die of starvation rather than giving in. So, for every woman that was a part of the suffragette movement, once she was arrested, whilst she was in prison, she would just refuse to eat. This then panicked the prison guards, who didn't really know what to do about the situation, and it resulted in really brutal force-feeding campaigns, which I'll come back to in a second. And this actually attracted a lot of sympathy towards the suffragettes, as newspapers got wind of what was happening, and this changed policy. Again, I'll come back to force-feeding later. As the years progressed, their tactics became more extreme. In 1913, Emmeline Pankhurst declared that the WSPU were guerrillerists who would destroy anything other than human life to get the vote. This then resulted in one of the most well-known events of the suffragette movement. A suffragette known as Emily Davidson threw herself under the King's horse in the 1913 Derby race, and she died the day later. There's a lot of discussion amongst historians as to whether she actually meant to kill herself. Some people argue that it was an act of suicide, that she deliberately threw herself under the King's horse, knowing that she would die and that she would die a martyr for the cause, for the right for women to vote. Other historians believe that that's actually not the case, that in fact she had a return train ticket in her top pocket, which suggests that actually she had planned to go home that night. She didn't mean to kill herself. Some people claim that she didn't throw herself under the King's horse, that actually, and there are videos of this on YouTube, I can't put them on here, but if you type it into YouTube you can see it. It's not really gory or bloody or anything like that. It's black and white. It's the video's not great. A lot of historians claim that what she was actually trying to do was run out and pin a badge on the King's horse, and the badge was a suffragette movement badge. But obviously horses run at exceptionally fast speed. When she sort of bobbed under the railing and ran towards the King's horse, the momentum of the horse's legs just dragged her underneath and the horse falls, crushing her. So a little bit of debate as to whether that was an act of suicide for the cause or whether actually it was just a horrible accident. Nonetheless, it certainly gained mass attention towards the cause of women and the fight to vote. However, the suffragettes had still not won the right to vote by 1914, despite all of the measures that they were taking. Many bills were presented to Parliament between the 1900s and 1914, but they were all defeated. And this is something that impacts both sides. By the time we get to 1914, both sides, suffragettes and suffragists, decide to halt their campaigns because World War I breaks out. and it was decided that World War One was more important than the campaign for women to vote. So they put everything on hold in order to support the war effort as best as they can. So hopefully, if you pause me now, you should be able to fill your Venn diagram full of information about the suffragists and the suffragettes, and information in the middle about both of them as well, because even though they in some respects are polar opposites, essentially they are both campaigning for the same thing. So make sure you've got as much detail as possible in there before we move on to the last thing I want you to do. Okay, so opposition. Even though women in both of the movements were taking a lot of action, be that peaceful protest or more violent action, how did the rest of the country feel about these two movements? Now, very careful there, because I very nearly said men, but it's not just men when we think about opposition. In fact, a lot of women opposed the groups as well, so you need to kind of bear in mind that not all women wanted the right to vote either. In 1910, the Men's National League for Opposing the Women's Franchise merged with a different group known as the Women's National Anti-Suffrage League, and they then formed one big league known as the National League for Opposing Women's Suffrage. This was basically a group of men and women that did not believe that women deserved the right to vote, and they then formed their own group to stage protest about it. It published the Anti-Suffrage Review, which said that women were not fit for government and that suffragettes neglected their families, and that's something I'll come back to in the final slide. In addition, so that was the opposition from ordinary people. We also see issues within government and how they decide to deal with this. The government sought to deal with the problem of hunger striking suffragettes with the 1913 Prisoners Act, which was also known as the Temporary Discharge for Ill Health. This became known as the Cat and Mouse Act. So, got a picture down here. It's a drawing of the force feeding of a suffragette. So as I said earlier, women that were arrested and put in prison for their actions refused to eat because they understood that this here, the Temporary Discharge for Ill Health Act, meant that they could only be kept in prison for a certain amount of time without food until they had to be released, and that was law. So to try and bypass that, prisoners would force feed the women to try and keep them, prison officers, would try to force feed women to keep them in the prisons for longer, really, and it was done in absolutely awful, brutal methods. They were pinned down, legs and feet tied, and then they had a tube literally shoved down their throat as far down as it could possibly go, and then liquidized food was poured down it. So it was literally just done to just enough food to keep the women alive. This act here becomes known as the Cat and Mouse Act because essentially, if you think about a cat and mouse act is something that's known as, like a bit of a chase. The idea was that it allowed for the early release of prisoners who were so weakened by hunger strikes that they were literally going to die if they weren't fed. So the suffragettes, if they weren't able to be force fed, were released from prison to go and eat at home. Then once they had eaten at home, the police officers would come back to their house and arrest them again. So it really was quite a stupid act, and it became known as the Cat and Mouse Act. The cat here being the police, constantly running round chasing after the mice, which were the suffragettes, and the suffragists, arresting them, putting them in prison for so long, and then having to let them go once they refused to eat. But you can see here that the government were willing to go to extreme lengths to prevent these women from being in public and publicly campaigning for the vote. And that leads me to the last thing here. These are just some of the propaganda posters that I was able to find online. There are so many more. What I want you to do is, before I'm going to go through each source, but before I do that, I just want you to pause me, and similar to the question at the start of the lesson, which I've asked you to complete on the quiz, you don't need to complete this one on the quiz, you can just do this on your pen and paper. from these propaganda posters, what do you think was the main concern about women receiving the vote? So have a look at these 4 different propaganda posters and just write down a couple of bullet points. What do you think was the main concern about women gaining the right to vote? So pause me now and then I'll go through these posters one by one. Right, okay, so first one here, this isn't actually a UK based source. This is an American poster, and it's called Since My Margaret Became a Suffragette. You can see here, this is Margaret, and this is her boyfriend or husband. He's on his knees, hands together, begging. He looks quite small, whereas she looks quite tall. She's pointing towards him, hand on her hip, and she's ordering down, she's bossing him around. So this is saying that since Margaret became a suffragette, she's become really bossy, and her poor boyfriend and husband is on the floor crying because he just can't cope with it. This one here, titled Peace at Last, has a woman in a particular contraption with a lock over her lips. If you can remember, I think it was lesson 2, so it's a couple of weeks back now, we looked at crime and punishment of women through time. And you should have seen something like this in the lesson. This was a medieval form of punishment for women that was seen as being gossips or women that talked badly about their husbands. And this was known as the bridle or the Branks bridle. And it was a contraption that you put over women's heads and it stopped them from talking. So now, 500 years later, men are still creating these posters to show that women shouldn't be speaking their mind, they shouldn't be thinking too much, that they should be seen and not heard and quiet, and the only way that you would get suffragettes and suffragists to shut up in order to have peace is to chain them up. Next one here, we've got what I assume to be a brother and sister. It says at the top, a woman's place is in the home. The sister has got her votes for women sash on, and she's got a votes for women flag, and her brother is ordering her around and says a woman's place is in the home, and there are toys on the floor here showing a little girl and a little boy just thrown on the floor because the girl isn't interested in playing with her dolls anymore. She wants to be out campaigning for women, and the little brother is shouting at her that you shouldn't be doing that because a woman's place is in the home. And the last picture here, it's called Election Day, and it has the wife and mother of the household dressed up for election day. She's got her sash on, she's going to go out and vote, and it's got a poster in the background that says, what is a suffragette without a suffering household? And it's got her husband here on a chair with their 2 little children, baby crying, toddler not looking too happy, with a bottle of milk in his hand, looking at his wife thinking, where are you going? Why aren't you staying here and looking after these children? And it's suggesting that their household is suffering because the woman, instead of being at home, like this poster suggests here, it says that she's out and about on election day when actually she should be in the home. So if you manage to get any of those points down, well done. Next lesson, we're going to be carrying on with this topic, but we're going to be thinking about the impact of World War I and how that changed identity of women and how that changed women's role within society and what impact that had on women's right to vote. Thank you for listening. Make sure you go on Teams and complete your quiz for me, please.